Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again with Suffolk Public Library and the Chesapeake Requiem program centered around climate change and sea level rise in the Chesapeake Bay. I'm joined here today by Dr. Molly Mitchell. She is Research Assistant Professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science in Gloucester. Hi, Dr. Mitchell. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Not everyone would be familiar with VIMS. Could you tell us a little bit about that school?
Sure. So we're the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. We are the School of Marine Science for the College of William and Mary. So we're affiliated with William and Mary. We're a graduate school, but we do have an undergraduate program at William and Mary. So there are marine science undergraduate classes as well. At our main campus, which is in Gloucester Point, is a graduate program. But our other interesting thing is that we actually have a role. We were originally developed to give the state advice on marine resource issues. So we have a specific role on an advisory side. So a lot of the science done at VIMS is to help address issues particular to Virginia, managing our resources and our fisheries.
Okay. So what kind of work do you do there? And what can you tell us about climate change in the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah, so I'm actually trained as an ecologist. I study mostly tidal marshes. But then in the past few years, I've become very engaged in sea level rise and how that is changing both the natural resources in the Chesapeake Bay. So it's changing tidal marshes. So that was part of the connection. But it's also impacting the communities. So looking at that and how we can adapt to it. I do look at this change in sea level and the trends and how sea level is changing over time. So every year we put out a sea level rise report card that looks at 32 stations around the United States and 5 in the Chesapeake Bay. And it just tracks how the rise rate is changing over time at those stations and what that might mean about our future. So those just came out for this year. We release them every year in the January, February timeframe.
And what does the Chesapeake Bay report card look like?
Well, the Virginia has the highest rate of sea level rise on the Atlantic coast.
Oh.
But it's actually, sea level is accelerating a little bit faster at some other stations. So we don't have the worst prognosis on the Atlantic coast, but we still are looking at probably close to 2 feet, 1.5 to 2 feet of sea level rise in the next 30 years. So pretty significant.
Wow.
So since 1970, we've had about 8 inches of sea level rise in this area. And then if you look into the next 30 years, it's, 3 times that amount.
So it's accelerating.
It is accelerating, yes. So every year it's basically coming up a little bit faster than it did the year before. So the numbers still sound small. So 5 millimeters a year sounds small. But when you make it, then the next year it's 5.5 millimeters a year, and then the next year it's 5 3/4 millimeters, and it starts to add up when you're looking at 20, 30, 50-year time periods.
So what impact could this sea level rise have besides the fact that there's more water than there used to be, right? I guess the shoreline would move.
Yes. So as sea level rises, the shoreline can erode faster. So the wave energy is actually related to how deep the water is. Shallow water breaks waves, just like, on a beach, when it comes up on the beach, the wave energy is broken. So shallow water helps break wave energy. The deeper the water gets, the less wave energy that's taken out of it before it hits the upland area. And so that increases the rate of erosion. It also could increased storm wave impacts. So we get flooding that comes in with big storms, but also along our our high energy shorelines, we get a lot of wave action that can cause damage with those big storms. So that's one of the big things is changing. So the shorelines are going to move in response to sea level rise. Marshes are also moving. So marshes are within that intertidal area. And as sea level rises, that intertidal area shifts upland. So, if you've lived in a house for 30 years, you might notice that the marsh grass used to always be between your house and the shore. And maybe now it's actually growing under your house or starting to creep around the sides of your house. And that's because the tide is moving up into the upland area. If you had a dock built in the 1960s, you might find that it's underwater now more often than it used to be. So there are these little impacts that are going to become much more noticeable in the next 30 years because sea level is going to be coming up at a faster rate. So where now you might have had to live in a house for 20 or 30 years to have seen any of these changes, now you're going to start to see them in a 10-year period or a 15-year period. And then one of the impacts that also has is we have our marshes are important. They're important for a number of reasons. They're important habitat for a number of fishery species. They're also important. They do help reduce wave energy. They also filter out contaminants from the water, pollutants, and they can filter out toxins too. So these marshes want to move inland with the tide. If we don't have space for them to move in, so if we've built roads, we've built houses, buildings, we've paved surfaces, there's nowhere for them to go, and they do start to drown, and then they will disappear. And so that will have impacts, throughout the ecosystem.
Well, here in the western part of Tidewater in Suffolk, and we're a lot closer to the James River than we are to the Chesapeake Bay. Is this still something that we have to worry about on the James?
Yes, so the rate of rise on the James down in the Suffolk area would be essentially the same as the tide gauge station at Sewell's Point in Norfolk, which is where we take most of our Virginia state planning data from. It's the tide gauge in Norfolk has been there since 1928, so it has a really long record. So we have a really good idea of how water levels are changing there.
Well, Suffolk is growing by leaps and bounds. Outside of, I think, Chesapeake City, it's the fastest growing city in Hampton Roads.
Wow.
We've got development all along the James River and a couple of creeks and the Nansemond River and reservoirs as well. We have a reservoir that sits on Suffolk land, or is inside the Suffolk city limits, but actually feeds Norfolk's population.
Mm. Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen with sea level rise is if you look at like Norfolk or Hampton, which are really cities that were developed a long time ago. Okay, so right. back when this tide gauge was put in, right, was when they were building these cities, sometimes before that. So these houses were not built in risky places at that time. But as sea levels come up, now they're in areas that flood regularly, some of them. And so one of the things that I think is important is we didn't know back in 1900 how sea level was going to change. So we didn't have a really good sense of what areas would be at risk in the future. Now we actually have good data. We have a good sense of how things are trending. So we can use that information to say, okay, we know this house is going to be here for 30 years. In fact, we might even want to have the same people living in it, right? A single mortgage, 30 years. Is that house going to be flooding in 30 years? Or is this house in an area that is at low risk from flooding? So we have the information to make really good decisions now. There's always a little bit of risk because we don't know exactly what's going to happen with sea level rise. You know, it could come up a foot, it could come up 2 feet. There's a little bit of uncertainty there, but we can make better decisions. We can make informed decisions if we look to what our future is going to be.
So I'm thinking of ways that people use the water. Real estate is obviously going to be one of them. Sport fishing is probably also a very big deal. Rockfish and other very popular sport fish that people will go after. What is the future of sport fishing, and is that related to climate change and sea level rise?
Yeah, it's not affected too much by sea level rise. The main concern with sea level rise would be if you lost nursery habitat for the fisheries species, for the species that you want to fish. And that depends a lot on the species. But we are also having warming waters. So the temperatures are rising across the bay waters. So what does that mean? It means that we have a lot of fish in the Chesapeake Bay that are living at the bottom of their range. They prefer cold water. So the Chesapeake Bay was as warm as they could handle. And now as those temperatures rise, their populations are migrating north. And then we're getting other populations that are migrating into the bay where it didn't used to be warm enough.
Oh,
so we're
okay.
starting to develop a shrimp fishery, which we had never had before.
And there's an invasive catfish too, I believe.
The blue catfish.
The blue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we do have blue catfish throughout the bay. That was a slightly different. Thing. It didn't come in because of the warm waters.
Oh no.
It was a stocked fish. Yeah.
And what about oysters and crabs are another important fishery in this part of the state?
Right. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the crabs. They live further south. They live in the Sound in North Carolina. So presumably it's not getting too warm for them yet in the Chesapeake Bay. In fact, they burrow into the sand in the wintertime because it's a little too cold for them. And so they might not have to do that anymore. So they're changing their behaviors, but we don't have any reason to think that the water is going to get too warm for them at this point. The oysters, the concern with them really is if the warm water brings disease with it. So our oyster populations have been recovering from diseases that really stress their populations. So if they bring more of those, or if they bring a lot of harmful algal blooms and things that those oysters might take up, we might not want to eat. That could also be an impact on not the oyster. It could be an impact on the oyster population, but also could be an impact on the fishery, like whether we still want to eat the oysters.
I know. I don't know if this is just of my own anecdotal experience, but gosh, it seems like there's more jellyfish than there used to be. Going to the beach seems the hottest months of the year, it seems like, is when the jellyfish swarm.
Yeah, so jellyfish distributions are related to temperature and salinity. So a mix of the right salinity and the right temperature. So as temperatures warm, you're getting that mix in different places. Okay. So the distribution might be changing a little bit of where you see them. And I actually don't know. There may be some new species also coming into the bay, just with the warmer waters. I don't know about that.
Well, what else could climate change and sea level rise, how else could that impact people's everyday lives?
Yeah, so flooding is a huge stressor. So we think about flooding a lot. We think about storms, like hurricanes come in and we get 3 feet, 5 feet of water. So these big flood events, and these flood events are very expensive. They're devastating for people whose homes get flooded, but they're actually relatively rare. We don't get big events like that very often. What started happening is that we're getting roads that go underwater for 2 hours during high tide. In the fall. The fall is when our tides tend to be highest. So they go through a little bit of a cycle throughout the year. They tend to be highest in the fall. So we're starting to get these roads that are underwater, and it's messing up commute times. It's messing up getting kids home from school on buses. There's an access issue there. And so it's small amounts of time, but those amounts of time are going to increase because sea level is rising. And that's going to disrupt our business, right? It's going to affect the economy. If that's happening on a road where people are working waterfront, where people have to get down to their boats and get out on certain tides to pull in their nets or their oyster cages or anything like that, then maybe they don't get out that day and they lose business that way. So it has this ability, it's a small impact, but as it happens more and more frequently, it has this potential to kind of ripple through the economy and affect our lives in a lot of small ways.
I would think of things like emergency response. If the street was flooded, then the ambulance would get to your house slower. The police would respond to a crisis slower. Um, and children might have trouble getting home from school, or your commute to work
Yeah.
might take longer than it used to.
Yeah. And so there are some places that are already seeing this kind of impact. And there are some places that aren't seeing it yet, but will be seeing it in the next 30 to 50 years. So it's going to become, again, a more noticeable impact. So right now it's kind of annoying, right? There are sometimes you can't get past down a road, but it's not at a point yet where most people feel their lives impacted. But I think it's going to become a more and more obvious impact.
Well, Dr. Mitchell, before I let you go, can I ask you to recommend some books that somebody who's curious about these topics might turn to read more about it?
Yeah, so of course you all are having Earl Swift, who wrote the Chesapeake Requiem, come and talk. So that's a great book about the experience of living through changing conditions, how that affects our lives. There was a book written a few years ago by Stephen Nash called Virginia Climate Fever that looks specifically at the changes that are happening in Virginia, and not just sea level rise, with increasing temperatures and changes in precipitation too. And if people are really, really interested in the sea level, tide, water levels portion of it, one of my colleagues, Dr. John Boon, wrote a book called Secrets of the Tide that picks apart all the information about how tides work and change.
Well, that sounds really interesting. If we don't already have those in the library, maybe we should order them.
Sounds good.
Uh, tell, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today. Tell us a little bit about VIM's Marine Science Day.
Sure. So Marine Science Day is an event held every year at VIMS. It's a free event, open to the public and particularly family friendly. It is all the labs at VIMS create opportunities for people to learn about their activities through hands-on interaction or tours. It's a lot of fun. And we have a lot of people who come out and look at it. So you can tour a marsh, you can go seining and see what kind of fish are living out in the bays. You can learn about the Arctic research programs or about how we're using drones or underwater robots to map things and understand how currents work and how they're changing. Yeah. So it's a great event. You can find out more about it on the VIMS website. If you search for VIMS Marine Science Day, it'll take you to the main page.
That sounds really neat. Thanks again, Dr. Mitchell. Really appreciate you coming to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.